In the heart of London, where centuries of tradition meet modern-day pressures, an 8-year-old prince was about to witness something that would test not just his character, but the very values the royal family stands for. What started as an ordinary morning at Buckingham Palace would become a defining moment that showed the world what true nobility really means. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the smallest voices. Sometimes it takes a child to remind adults what courage actually looks like. And sometimes, in a world full of cameras and expectations, the most authentic moments happen when no one thinks anyone important is watching. This is the story of how Prince George, third in line to the British throne, saw injustice unfold right before his eyes and made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. It's a story about standing up for what's right, even when you're just a kid, even when it's scary, even when no one expects you to understand the weight of the moment. What happened next would ripple through the palace walls, reach the highest levels of the royal family, and remind a nation that sometimes the most profound acts of leadership come from the most unexpected places. This is that story. The September morning air carried a crisp hint of autumn as Prince George walked through the familiar corridors of Buckingham Palace. At 8 years old, he had grown accustomed to the grandeur surrounding him, but today felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors, or maybe it was simply the restless energy that comes with being a curious child in a place where every room held centuries of history. George had always been drawn to the palace guards. Unlike the adults who spoke to him with careful, measured words, the guards represented something solid and unchanging in his world. They stood tall and proud in their red tunics and black bearskin hats, silent sentinels who watched over his family with unwavering dedication. He had often wondered what it would be like to stand so still for so long, to carry such responsibility on their shoulders. His nanny, Maria, had given him permission to explore the East Wing while she attended to some administrative duties. It was a rare moment of freedom for the young prince, who was usually accompanied by at least one adult wherever he went. The East Wing housed many of the service areas of the palace, places where the real work happened behind the scenes to keep the royal household running smoothly. As he wandered through the corridors, George could hear the distant sounds of palace life. Kitchen staff preparing for the day's meals, housekeepers ensuring every surface gleamed, and the steady footsteps of guards changing their posts. It was like a carefully choreographed dance that had been performed for generations, each person playing their part in maintaining the dignity and function of the crown. The corridor he found himself in was quieter than the main thoroughfares. Here, tall windows looked out onto one of the palace's inner courtyards, and oil paintings of long-dead monarchs gazed down from their ornate frames. George paused at one particular painting of King George III, his ancestor, wondering if that George had ever felt as curious about the world around him as he did now. It was then that he heard voices coming from around the corner ahead. Not the usual respectful murmurs that echoed through the palace halls, but something sharper, more aggressive. George's natural curiosity got the better of him, and he quietly approached the corner, pressing himself against the wall to listen. What he heard made his stomach twist with an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't quite name. A man's voice, harsh and demanding, was speaking to someone in a tone that George had never heard used within the palace walls. The voice belonged to someone who clearly thought they were important, someone who was used to getting their way. "I don't care what your protocols are," the voice was saying. "Do you know who I am? I'm a member of Parliament, and I have every right to inspect these areas. Your job is to follow orders, not to think." Another voice responded, calm and professional despite the obvious tension. "Sir, with respect, I have my orders from my commanding officer. These areas are restricted without proper authorization. If you would like to arrange a proper tour, I can direct you to the appropriate office." George recognized the second voice. It belonged to Guardsman Williams, one of the younger guards who had always been particularly kind to him. Williams had served in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard, and though he maintained the required stoic demeanor while on duty, George had occasionally caught glimpses of warmth in his eyes during their brief encounters. The first voice erupted with indignation. "Don't you dare lecture me about authorization, you glorified doorman. I serve the people of this country, while you just stand around looking pretty in that ridiculous costume. Now step aside before I have you removed from your position." George felt his face flush with anger. No one should speak to Guardsman Williams like that. No one should speak to any of the guards like that. These men had dedicated their lives to serving his family and the country. They deserved respect, not this cruel treatment. He could hear the MP's footsteps approaching the guard's position, the sound echoing aggressively off the stone walls. I said move. The man's voice had dropped to a threatening whisper. Or do I need to remind you that people like me can make people like you disappear with a single phone call? The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. George could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of fear and outrage coursing through his small frame. He had learned about bullies in his studies with his tutors, but this was the first time he was witnessing bullying firsthand. And it was happening to someone he cared about, someone who had always shown him kindness and respect. Guardsman Williams's response came after a long pause, his voice steady but strained. Sir, I understand your frustration, but I cannot abandon my post or ignore my orders. If you wish to file a complaint about my conduct, you're welcome to do so through the proper channels. This only seemed to enrage the MP further. Proper channels? He spat. Let me tell you about proper channels, you insignificant little man. I'll have you court-martialed. I'll have you stripped of that uniform. I'll make sure you never work in any capacity for the government again. Do you understand me? George pressed closer to the wall, his small hands clenched into fists. He could picture Guardsman Williams standing there, maintaining his professional composure while being subjected to this verbal assault. The injustice of it all made his chest feel tight with emotion. The MP continued his tirade. You military types think you're so special, don't you? With your medals, and your ceremonies, and your fancy uniforms. But, at the end of the day, you're nothing but servants. My servants. And servants who don't obey their masters get replaced. Each word felt like a physical blow to George. He thought about all the times he had seen the guards standing motionless in the hot sun, the cold rain, and the bitter wind. He thought about the stories his father had told him about their bravery and sacrifice. These men were heroes, not servants to be abused by bullies in expensive suits. The young prince found himself at a crossroads. He could quietly retreat back the way he had come, pretend he had never witnessed this confrontation, and continue with his day as if nothing had happened. It would be the safe choice, the easy choice. No one would ever know that he had been there. But, as he listened to the MP's continued verbal assault on Guardsman Williams, George realized that he couldn't just walk away. Something deep inside him, something that perhaps came from his royal bloodline or maybe just from being a decent human being, told him that this was wrong. This was exactly the kind of behavior that his parents had always told him to stand against. His grandmother, the Queen, had often spoken to him about duty and responsibility. Not just the duty that came with being born into the royal family, but the responsibility that every person has to stand up for what is right. She had told him stories of her own father, King George VI, who had found his voice during the darkest days of World War II when his country needed leadership most. Now, standing in that corridor with his heart hammering in his chest, 8-year-old Prince George was about to discover his own voice. He was about to learn that sometimes the right thing to do is also the scariest thing to do, and that true courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. The MP's voice rose again, now filled with what sounded like genuine malice. I want your name and your commanding officer's contact information. By the end of today, you'll be nothing more than an unemployed has-been with delusions of grandeur. Perhaps that will teach you some humility. That was the moment George made his decision. Taking a deep breath and straightening his shoulders in a gesture that would have made his royal ancestors proud, the young prince stepped around the corner. What he saw confirmed everything he had imagined. Guardsman Williams standing at perfect attention, his face a mask of professional calm despite the obvious distress in his eyes, while a red-faced man in an expensive suit loomed over him like a predator circling wounded prey. Neither the MP nor the guardsman had noticed George's arrival yet, giving the young prince a moment to gather his courage. He thought about his father's words about leadership, his mother's lessons about compassion, and his grandmother's teachings about duty. In that moment, Prince George understood that being royal wasn't about privilege, it was about responsibility. And his responsibility was clear. He had to act. The sound of George's small footsteps on the marble floor seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Both men turned at the same time, their faces showing completely different expressions when they realized who had joined them in the corridor. Guardsman Williams's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his professional composure. Years of training had prepared him for many situations, but having a young member of the royal family witness him being verbally assaulted by a government official was not something covered in any manual. His immediate instinct was to protect the prince from this unpleasant situation, but protocol dictated that he could not abandon his post. The MP's reaction was entirely different. The angry red flush on his face immediately began to fade as recognition dawned. His mouth, which had been twisted with rage just moments before, fell open in surprise. Here was a child he had seen countless times in newspapers and on television, standing just a few feet away with an expression of calm determination that seemed far too mature for his years. "Your Royal Highness," the MP stammered, his entire demeanor shifting like a chameleon changing colors. The aggressive posture melted away, replaced by an awkward attempt at deference. He executed what could charitably be called a bow, though it looked more like he was having trouble with his back. "I had no idea. That is, I wasn't informed that you would be in this area." George looked at the man with the steady gaze he had inherited from generations of monarchs. He had been taught from an early age how to read people, how to see past their words to their true intentions. What he saw in the MP's eyes was not respect or genuine deference, but calculation. This was a man who changed his behavior based on who was watching, not someone guided by consistent principles. "Good morning," George replied politely, his voice clear and steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. He had been raised to be courteous to everyone, regardless of their behavior, but that didn't mean he was going to ignore what he had witnessed. "I heard voices and wanted to make sure everything was all right." The MP's smile was oily and false, the kind of expression adults sometimes wore when they thought children were too naive to see through their pretense. "Oh, everything is perfectly fine, Your Royal Highness. Just a small misunderstanding about palace protocols. Nothing for you to worry your young head about." The condescending tone made George's jaw tighten slightly, another trait inherited from his royal lineage. He had dealt with adults who spoke down to him before, but never in such a situation where their true character had already been revealed. The man's dismissive attitude only strengthened his resolve to address what he had witnessed. "I don't think it was just a misunderstanding," George said, his voice gaining confidence with each word. "I heard you threatening Guardsman Williams. That didn't sound like a misunderstanding to me." The MP's false smile flickered like a candle in the wind. He glanced nervously between the young prince and the guard, clearly trying to calculate how to handle this unexpected complication. His political instincts told him to retreat, to find a way to minimize the damage to his reputation, but his ego was still smarting from being challenged by what he saw as a mere soldier. "Your Royal Highness, I think you may have misunderstood what you heard," the MP said, his tone becoming more carefully modulated. "As a member of Parliament, I was simply exercising my oversight responsibilities. Sometimes these conversations can sound more heated than they actually are." Guardsman Williams remained at attention, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but George could see the tension in his jaw. The guard was caught in an impossible situation, bound by protocol to remain silent unless directly addressed by a member of the royal family, yet witnessing a child defend him against an adult's verbal assault. George took a step closer to the MP, drawing himself up to his full height, which admittedly wasn't very impressive at 8 years old. But there was something in his bearing, something in the way he carried himself, that commanded attention despite his small stature. It was the presence that came from knowing, without arrogance, exactly who he was and what he represented. "I know what threatening sounds like," George said firmly. "And I know what respect sounds like too. What I heard wasn't respect." He paused, gathering his thoughts in the way his tutors had taught him when making important points. "Guardsman Williams serves my family. He's a good man who has served our country. He deserves to be treated with dignity." The MP's face began to show signs of his earlier anger returning, but he was clearly struggling to control himself in front of the prince. "Your Royal Highness, while I appreciate your loyalty to the staff, these are complex adult matters. Perhaps you should return to your activities and let the grown-ups handle this situation." The dismissive comment was exactly the wrong thing to say to a child who had been raised to understand the weight of responsibility from birth. George felt a flash of the same indignation that had driven him to step forward in the first place. This man wasn't just bullying Guardsman Williams. He was now trying to dismiss George himself, as if his concerns didn't matter. "I may be young," George replied, his voice taking on a quality that those who knew him well would recognize as distinctly royal, "but I know right from wrong. And threatening someone who can't defend themselves because of their job is wrong." The corridor fell silent except for the distant sounds of palace life continuing around them. The MP found himself in a position he had never anticipated, being lectured on morality by an 8-year-old prince, and finding that he had no adequate response. His political experience had prepared him for debates with colleagues, confrontations with journalists, and negotiations with constituents, but not for this. Guardsman Williams, despite his training to remain impassive, felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced since his commendation ceremony after returning from Afghanistan. It was pride, but not the professional pride that came from doing his duty well. This was something deeper, something more personal. Here was a child, a member of the very family he had sworn to protect, standing up for him when he couldn't stand up for himself. George turned slightly to address the guard directly. "Guardsman Williams, are you all right? Did this man hurt you or threaten you?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Williams was directly addressed by a member of the royal family, which meant he could respond. But his training warred with his desire to tell the truth. He couldn't speak against a government official, even one who had treated him poorly, without potentially causing a diplomatic incident. "Your Royal Highness," Williams said carefully, "I am unharmed, and I am committed to carrying out my duties regardless of the circumstances." It was a diplomatically perfect response that said everything and nothing at the same time. But George was learning to read between the lines, a skill that would serve him well in his future role. He understood that Guardsman Williams was confirming what had happened without saying anything that could get him in trouble. The MP seized on what he thought was an opportunity to regain control of the situation. "You see, Your Royal Highness? The guardsman himself says there's no problem. Perhaps we should all move on from this minor incident." But George wasn't ready to move on. Something his grandfather, Prince Philip, had once told him came to mind. "Character isn't what you do when people are watching, George. It's what you do when you think no one important is looking." The MP had shown his true character when he thought he was dealing only with a guard who couldn't fight back. Now George was going to show his. "Just because someone says they're all right doesn't mean what happened to them was okay," George said, his young voice carrying a wisdom that surprised even him. "If someone is mean to people who can't be mean back, that tells you what kind of person they really are." The simple truth of the statement hit the MP like a physical blow. In his years of political maneuvering and power plays, he had forgotten that sometimes the most profound truths come from the most innocent sources. This child had, in a few words, exposed the cowardly nature of his behavior more effectively than any political opponent ever had. The MP's face cycled through several emotions: anger, embarrassment, calculation, and, finally, what might have been shame. He was beginning to realize that this encounter was not going to end the way he had planned. What had started as a simple intimidation of a palace guard was becoming something much more complicated, something that could have serious consequences for his career if it became public. "Your Royal Highness," he said, his voice now noticeably more respectful. "Perhaps I did speak more harshly than necessary. The pressures of my position sometimes, that is. I may have been having a difficult morning." It was an apology of sorts, though not a very good one. George had been taught to recognize genuine remorse from mere expedience, and this clearly fell into the latter category. The MP was sorry he had been caught, not sorry for his behavior. "Everyone has difficult mornings," George replied with the kind of simple wisdom that only children possess. "But that doesn't give anyone the right to be mean to other people, especially people who are just trying to do their jobs." As the young prince spoke, something remarkable was happening within him. All the lessons about leadership, responsibility, and moral courage that he had absorbed throughout his short life were crystallizing into something real and immediate. This wasn't about memorizing the names of past monarchs or learning about constitutional law. This was about using whatever power and influence he possessed to protect someone who needed protection. And, for the first time in his life, Prince George was beginning to understand what it truly meant to be royal. The tension in the corridor had shifted dramatically from the moment Prince George arrived, but now it was evolving into something entirely different. What had begun as a one-sided verbal assault had become a three-way conversation where the balance of power was clearly with the smallest person present. The MP, despite his political experience and adult authority, found himself increasingly uncomfortable under the steady gaze of an 8-year-old who seemed to see right through his attempts at damage control. "Your Royal Highness," the MP tried again, his voice taking on what he probably thought was a fatherly tone. "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot here. Perhaps if we could speak privately, I could explain the complexities of the situation." George tilted his head slightly, a gesture that made him look remarkably like his father when Prince William was considering a difficult question. Why would we need to speak privately? Guardsman Williams was here for everything that happened. Shouldn't he be part of any conversation about what occurred? The suggestion clearly made the MP uncomfortable. The last thing he wanted was to have this conversation continue with the guard present as a witness to his behavior. His political instincts told him to separate the parties, control the narrative, and minimize the potential for this incident to become something larger than he could manage. Well, you see, the MP stammered. Sometimes adult conversations involve nuances that might be difficult for someone so young to fully grasp. I wouldn't want to burden you with unnecessary complications. George's response came without hesitation, delivered with the kind of direct honesty that adults often found both refreshing and uncomfortable. I understood everything that happened perfectly well. You were trying to bully Guardsman Williams because you thought no one important was watching. But someone was watching, and now you're sorry you got caught, not sorry for what you did. The simple accuracy of the assessment left the MP speechless for a moment. In his years of political maneuvering, he had become accustomed to layers of subtext, diplomatic language, and carefully crafted messages designed to obscure as much as they revealed. Being confronted with such straightforward truth-telling was like having a bright light suddenly turned on in a room where he had become comfortable in the shadows. Guardsman Williams maintained his position of attention, but George could see something in his eyes that looked like pride mixed with amazement. The young prince was saying things that the guard could never say himself, standing up for him in a way that his position and training would never allow him to stand up for himself. Furthermore, George continued, the word choice showing his excellent education. I don't think this is the first time you've spoken to people this way. I think you do this to people who can't fight back because it makes you feel powerful. But real power isn't about making people afraid of you. It's about making people feel safe and protected. The MP's face had gone through several color changes during this exchange, settling finally on a pale shade that suggested he was beginning to understand the serious nature of his predicament. This wasn't just an embarrassing encounter that he could brush aside and forget. This was a member of the royal family. A child, yes, but still a prince, who had witnessed his behavior and was clearly not going to simply ignore what had happened. Your Royal Highness, he said, his voice now noticeably shakier. I want you to know that I have the utmost respect for the royal family and for the service members who protect you. If my words or actions suggested otherwise, I deeply regret any misunderstanding. George studied the man's face with the intensity of someone far older than his years. His tutors had taught him about the importance of reading people's intentions, not just their words. What he saw in the MP's expression was fear and calculation, not genuine remorse or understanding. That's another kind of lie, George said quietly. A polite lie, but still a lie. You're not sorry for what you did to Guardsman Williams. You're sorry that I saw you do it. Those are completely different things. The young prince's words hung in the air like an indictment. In his short life, George had been surrounded by people who often told him what they thought he wanted to hear. But his parents had always emphasized the importance of truth. They had taught him to value honesty above politeness, integrity above convenience. Now he was applying those lessons in real time, and the results were both illuminating and powerful. The MP made one more attempt to regain control of the narrative. Perhaps, Your Royal Highness, you're being a bit harsh in your judgment. We all make mistakes, and surely there's room for forgiveness and moving forward. This approach might have worked on many adults, who often choose social harmony over uncomfortable truths. But George had been raised to understand that some things were more important than keeping peace, that sometimes the right thing to do was also the difficult thing to do. Forgiveness is important, George agreed, but it has to come after someone admits they were wrong and shows they understand why what they did was hurtful. You haven't done that. You've just made excuses and tried to make this problem go away without fixing anything. For Guardsman Williams, listening to this exchange was like watching a masterclass in moral leadership delivered by someone who was barely tall enough to reach the man's shoulder. The prince wasn't just defending him. He was articulating principles of justice and accountability that many adults struggled to understand, let alone implement. The MP was beginning to realize that his usual tactics weren't going to work in this situation. He couldn't intimidate Prince George the way he had tried to intimidate the guard. He couldn't appeal to the prince's professional obligations or threaten his career prospects. And he couldn't simply dismiss the child's concerns as unimportant, not when that child was a member of the royal family. What would you like me to do, Your Royal Highness? The MP asked, and for the first time in the conversation, his question seemed genuine rather than calculated. George considered this carefully. He wasn't just thinking about what would make him feel better or what would embarrass the MP. He was thinking about what would be right, what would actually address the harm that had been done, and what might prevent similar situations from happening in the future. First, George said, You should apologize to Guardsman Williams. A real apology where you admit what you did wrong and why it was wrong. Not an apology for misunderstandings or difficult mornings or any of those other excuses you tried to use. The MP looked uncomfortable with this suggestion, clearly preferring to handle the matter through more formal channels where he might have more control over the outcome. But George's steady gaze made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation. Second, George continued, you should think about whether you treat other people the same way you treated Guardsman Williams when you think no one important is watching. Because if you do, then you need to stop. It's not right, and it's not what people who serve the public should do. The simple moral clarity of these requests was harder to argue with than any complex political proposition might have been. George wasn't asking for anything unreasonable or vindictive. He was simply asking for basic human decency and accountability. The MP found himself in a position where his choices were limited, and none of them were particularly appealing to his ego. He could continue to resist, which would likely escalate the situation and potentially involve more senior members of the royal family or palace administration. Or he could comply with the prince's requests, which would require him to admit his wrongdoing in front of the very person he had attempted to intimidate. During this pause in the conversation, George made a decision that would later be remembered as one of the defining moments of his young life. Rather than simply waiting for the MP to respond, he turned to address Guardsman Williams directly. Guardsman Williams, George said, his voice taking on a formal quality that somehow made him seem older than his years. I want you to know that what this man said to you was wrong. You are not a servant to be bullied. You are a protector and a hero, and you deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. I'm sorry that someone spoke to you that way in my family's home. The impact of these words on Guardsman Williams was immediately visible. Despite his training to remain composed, his eyes showed a mixture of gratitude, pride, and something that might have been wonder. In his years of service, he had received commendations and recognition for his military achievements, but never had anyone, least of all a member of the royal family, acknowledged his fundamental human dignity in such a direct and personal way. For the MP, watching this exchange was like seeing his own behavior reflected in a mirror that revealed its true ugliness. The contrast between the prince's natural grace and his own earlier cruelty was impossible to ignore. And, in that moment, perhaps for the first time in years, he felt genuine shame for his actions rather than just concern for their consequences. The silence that followed Prince George's words to Guardsman Williams seemed to stretch on forever, though it probably lasted only seconds. In that quiet moment, the three individuals in the corridor were each processing what had just occurred from their very different perspectives. The MP was grappling with the uncomfortable realization that an 8-year-old had just demonstrated more moral leadership than he had shown in years of public service. Guardsman Williams was experiencing a profound sense of vindication and protection that he had never expected to receive. And George himself was discovering something important about the weight of his words and the responsibility that came with his position. The MP cleared his throat awkwardly, finally, understanding that he had reached a point where his usual strategies would no longer work. The political calculation that had guided his entire adult life was telling him that the least damaging path forward required genuine accountability, not continued deflection. Guardsman Williams, he said, his voice notably different from the harsh, threatening tone he had used earlier. The change was so dramatic that it seemed like a completely different person was speaking. I owe you an apology. A real one, as His Royal Highness pointed out. Williams's training kept him at attention, but George could see the subtle shift in his posture that indicated he was listening carefully to what was being said. What I said to you earlier was completely inappropriate and inexcusable, the MP continued, the words clearly difficult for him to say, but becoming more genuine as he spoke. You were doing your job exactly as you should, following your orders, and maintaining security protocols. I had no right to speak to you the way I did, to threaten your position, or to treat you with such disrespect. George watched this apology carefully, his young face serious and thoughtful. He was learning to distinguish between words spoken because they were necessary and words spoken because they were felt. This apology, while clearly uncomfortable for the MP to deliver, was beginning to sound more authentic than his earlier attempts at damage control. Furthermore, the MP added, looking directly at the guard now, your service to our country, both in the military and in your current position, deserves recognition and respect, not the treatment I gave you. I was wrong, and I am sorry. Guardsman Williams's response was measured and professional, but there was something in his voice that suggested genuine acceptance of the apology. "Thank you, sir. I accept your apology." George nodded approvingly at this exchange, but he wasn't finished with his own role in the situation. Something his mother had often told him about leadership came to mind, that true leaders don't just solve immediate problems, they work to prevent similar problems from occurring in the future. "Mr." George paused, realizing he didn't know the MP's name. "Thompson," the MP supplied. "Malcolm Thompson, Member of Parliament for Eastbridge." "Mr. Thompson," George continued, "I'm glad you apologized to Guardsman Williams. But I'm wondering if you might tell me why you spoke to him that way in the first place. Because understanding that might help make sure it doesn't happen again." The question was delivered with such genuine curiosity and lack of malice that Thompson found himself actually considering it seriously rather than simply providing a defensive response. The prince wasn't trying to embarrass him further or score points. He was trying to understand the root cause of the behavior so it could be addressed. Thompson took a deep breath before answering, and when he spoke, there was a vulnerability in his voice that hadn't been there before. "I suppose, Your Royal Highness, it was because I was frustrated about something completely unrelated to Guardsman Williams, and I took that frustration out on someone who couldn't fight back. That's not an excuse. It's an explanation of why I behaved badly." George nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. People do that sometimes when they're upset about one thing but can't fix it, so they get angry at something else instead. But that doesn't make it okay, does it?" "No," Thompson agreed. "It absolutely does not make it okay." The conversation was taking on an almost therapeutic quality, with George's innocent but insightful questions helping Thompson examine his own behavior in a way that he probably hadn't done in years. It was remarkable to witness, an 8-year-old child helping an adult understand the moral implications of his actions. "The thing is," George continued, "when people in important positions treat other people badly, it's not just mean to those people. It also makes everyone else think that's how they're supposed to behave. So when you're mean to Guardsman Williams, other people might think it's okay for them to be mean to guards or soldiers or other people who serve the public." This observation hit Thompson with particular force because it addressed something he had never considered, the broader impact of his behavior beyond its immediate target. As a politician, he was accustomed to thinking about the public implications of his official actions, but he had never considered how his personal behavior might influence others or reflect on the institutions he represented. "You're absolutely right, Your Royal Highness," Thompson said, and this time there was no calculation in his voice, just genuine recognition of an important truth. "I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're completely right." Guardsman Williams, still maintaining his professional posture, was witnessing something extraordinary. He had served under various commanders and had encountered numerous government officials in his career, but he had never seen anything quite like this. A child teaching an adult about leadership and moral responsibility, and doing it with such natural grace that the lesson was being received rather than resisted. George seemed to sense that the conversation had reached a turning point, that the real issues had been addressed and acknowledged. But he wasn't quite ready to let the matter drop entirely. There was one more element that he felt needed to be discussed. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "can I ask you something else?" "Of course, Your Royal Highness." "Do you think this is the first time you've spoken to someone this way when you thought no one important was watching?" The question was delivered without accusation or judgment, but it cut to the heart of something crucial. Thompson found himself actually considering his past behavior with an honesty that surprised him. How many times had he been short with staff members, dismissive of service workers, or condescending to people he perceived as having less power than him? "I'm afraid it probably isn't, Your Royal Highness," Thompson admitted. "And that's something I need to think very seriously about changing." George nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished what he set out to do. "That's good. Because if you change how you treat people when you think no one is watching, then you'll become a better person all the time, not just when it's convenient." The wisdom of this statement was so clear and so profound that it left both adults momentarily speechless. Here was an 8-year-old articulating a principle of character development that many people spent their entire lives struggling to understand and implement. As the conversation appeared to be winding down, George made one final gesture that would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. He turned to Guardsman Williams and, in a voice that carried the formal authority of his position despite his young age, said, "Guardsman Williams, on behalf of my family, I want to thank you for your service and for the dignity with which you handled this situation. You represented the crown, and yourself with honor." Williams's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. It has been my privilege to serve." Then, George turned back to Thompson. "And, Mr. Thompson, I hope you'll remember this conversation. Not because you got in trouble, but because it showed you something important about the kind of person you want to be." Thompson nodded, and, for the first time since the encounter began, his expression showed something approaching genuine respect rather than mere deference to rank. "I will remember, Your Royal Highness. Thank you for the lesson." As the immediate crisis seemed to have been resolved, George found himself thinking about what came next. He understood instinctively that this situation couldn't simply be forgotten. There were larger principles at stake, and people needed to be held accountable for their actions. But he also understood that handling this properly would require involving adults who had more authority and experience than he did. The young prince was learning one of the most important lessons about leadership, knowing when to act decisively in the moment, and when to involve others who could ensure that the right long-term outcomes were achieved. This incident had taught him about his own power to influence situations and defend those who needed defending, but it had also shown him the importance of follow-through and systemic change. What happened next would test not just George's understanding of right and wrong, but his grasp of how institutions work and how lasting change is achieved. As the immediate tension in the corridor began to dissipate, Prince George found himself facing a new kind of challenge. He had successfully confronted the MP's behavior and secured an apology for Guardsman Williams, but his instincts told him that the matter couldn't simply end there. This wasn't just about one unpleasant encounter. It was about something larger, something that required more than just personal resolution. "Mr. Thompson," George said, his voice taking on a thoughtful quality, "I think my parents need to know about this conversation. Not to get you in more trouble, but because they should understand what happened here today." Thompson's face showed a flicker of the anxiety he had been trying to suppress, but he nodded with resignation. He had been in politics long enough to know that attempting to cover up this incident would likely make things much worse if it eventually came to light, which it inevitably would given the people involved. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," Thompson replied. "I understand completely, and I think that's the right thing to do." George appreciated this response because it showed that Thompson was beginning to understand the broader implications of his actions. This wasn't just about what had happened between him and Guardsman Williams. It was about what his behavior represented and what needed to change to prevent similar incidents in the future. "Guardsman Williams," George said, turning to the guard, "I want you to know that you shouldn't worry about reporting what happened here. You did nothing wrong, and no one should be upset with you for telling the truth about what occurred." This was an important point that George had learned from his father's discussions about leadership and institutional culture. Often, people who were mistreated were reluctant to report incidents because they feared retaliation or because they felt their complaints wouldn't be taken seriously. By explicitly encouraging Williams to be honest about what had happened, George was removing some of the pressure that might otherwise prevent the truth from coming out. Williams nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. I will provide an accurate and complete account of the incident if requested to do so." As the three of them stood in the corridor, George realized that he needed to think carefully about how to handle the next phase of this situation. He was still just a child, and while his intervention had been necessary and effective in the moment, the longer-term resolution would require involving adults who had the authority and experience to address systemic issues. His first thought was to find his nanny, Maria, who would be expecting him to return from his exploration of the palace. But, as he considered the matter more carefully, George realized that this situation was serious enough to warrant involving his parents directly. They needed to hear about this from him personally, not filtered through layers of staff reports. "Mr. Thompson," George said, "I think you should probably leave now, but I also think you should expect to hear from someone in my family's office about this incident. Not as punishment, but because we need to make sure that the people who work for us are treated properly by everyone who visits the palace." Thompson nodded with what appeared to be genuine understanding. "I completely agree, Your Royal Highness. And, again, I want to emphasize how sorry I am for my behavior and how much I respect the lesson you've taught me today." As Thompson prepared to leave, George made one final observation that would stay with the MP for the rest of his life. "Mr. Thompson, I think you're probably a better person than you showed today. I hope you'll remember that being better all the time is more important than just being sorry when you get caught." The simple profundity of this statement left Thompson speechless for a moment. Here was a child offering him not condemnation, but hope, the possibility of redemption and growth. It was more grace than he felt he deserved, but it was exactly what he needed to hear to begin making real changes in his life. After Thompson departed, George and Guardsman Williams stood together in the corridor for a moment. The guard was still technically on duty, but the unusual nature of the situation created a brief space for more personal interaction. Guardsman Williams, George said, "Are you really okay? I know you said you were, but I want to make sure." Williams's response showed both his professional training and his genuine appreciation for the prince's concern. "I am fine, Your Royal Highness. What happened today was unpleasant, but your intervention turned it into something I'll remember positively for the rest of my life. You didn't have to stand up for me, but you did, and that means more than I can express." George smiled at this response, feeling a warm sense of satisfaction that came not from proving he was right, but from knowing he had helped someone who needed help. "My parents always tell me that if you see someone being treated unfairly and you don't do anything about it, then you're part of the problem. I didn't want to be part of the problem." This simple explanation revealed something important about George's moral education. His parents had clearly worked hard to instill in him the understanding that privilege comes with responsibility, that his position in society obligated him to use whatever influence he had to protect those who needed protection. As George made his way back through the palace corridors to find Maria, his mind was processing everything that had just occurred. He felt proud of how he had handled the situation, but he also felt the weight of what it meant to take action in difficult circumstances. This had been his first real test of the principles his parents had taught him, and while it had turned out well, he understood that not every situation would be so clear-cut. When he found Maria in the East Wing administrative offices, her relief at seeing him was immediately replaced by concern when she noticed his thoughtful, serious expression. "George, is everything all right?" she asked, using the informal address that was permitted when they were alone. "I need to talk to my parents," George replied. "Something important happened that they need to know about." Maria recognized the tone in his voice. This wasn't a child's drama or a minor complaint, but something that genuinely required adult attention. Without asking for details, she immediately began making arrangements to contact Prince William and Catherine. Within an hour, George found himself in his father's private study, recounting the entire incident to both his parents. He told the story methodically and honestly, including his own feelings and reactions as well as the facts of what had occurred. He didn't try to make himself look heroic or to exaggerate Thompson's wrongdoing. He simply told the truth as he had experienced it. Prince William and Catherine listened to their son's account with a mixture of pride and concern. They were proud of his moral courage and his instinctive understanding of right and wrong, but they were also concerned about what the incident revealed about the treatment of palace staff and the need for better protections against such behavior. "You did exactly the right thing, George," his father said when the story was complete. "Standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves is one of the most important responsibilities we have." Catherine added her own perspective. "I'm particularly proud of how you handled Mr. Thompson after his apology. You could have been angry or vindictive, but instead you tried to help him understand how to be better in the future. That showed real wisdom and compassion." But beyond their pride in their son's behavior, William and Catherine recognized that this incident required a broader response. They arranged for a formal investigation of the incident, not to punish Thompson further, but to review palace policies and procedures to ensure that staff members had proper protections against harassment or intimidation. They also used the incident as a catalyst for broader discussions within the royal household about the treatment of staff and the expectations for behavior by all visitors to royal properties. New protocols were established for reporting inappropriate behavior, and training programs were expanded to ensure that all staff members understood their rights and the support available to them. Perhaps most importantly, Prince William arranged to meet personally with Guardsman Williams to thank him for his service and to ensure that he felt supported by the royal family. This meeting, while private, sent a clear message throughout the palace community that the royal family valued and respected every member of their staff. In the weeks that followed, word of George's intervention began to spread through the palace community, though the details were kept confidential. The story became a source of pride among the staff, not because it involved a confrontation, but because it demonstrated that the next generation of the royal family truly understood and embodied the values of service and protection of others. For Guardsman Williams, the incident became a defining moment in his service to the crown. He had always taken pride in his duties, but now he also took pride in serving a family that had shown such genuine care for his well-being and dignity. For Malcolm Thompson, the encounter with Prince George became a turning point in his approach to public service and personal conduct. He began making genuine efforts to treat all people with respect regardless of their position or ability to affect his career. The lesson he had learned from an 8-year-old prince became a guiding principle that improved not just his own character, but his effectiveness as a public servant. And for Prince George himself, the incident became the first real example of how he could use his position and voice to make a positive difference in the world. It taught him that leadership wasn't about giving orders or receiving deference, but about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. Years later, when George would face much larger and more complex challenges as he prepared for his eventual role as king, he would often think back to that morning in the palace corridor. It had been his first real lesson in moral leadership, his first understanding of how power could be used to protect rather than intimidate, and his first glimpse of the kind of monarch he wanted to become. The ripples from that single act of courage would continue to spread throughout his life, shaping not just his own character, but influencing everyone around him to be better, more compassionate, and more courageous in their own lives. Sometimes the most important moments come in the most ordinary places, and sometimes the most powerful lessons are taught by the smallest voices speaking the simplest truths.